The 4 decades of rock on 106.1 Rock Radio. All this week, the 60s. If you can remember it, you probably weren't there. Today, life.
Let's talk about 60s culture now. To Dr. Tim Wise from the University of Salford from the Popular Music and Recording degree. Dr. Tim Wise, has there ever been a time when, if we talk about culture, it was so integrated, where music and design and cinema and literature and art all seem to be one sort of swirling, massive, fantastic creativity?
Yeah, I think you're right. That was a unique fusion of these things, and it's where new technologies, new sense of fashion, but as you rightly say, also a kind of a blending with high art culture, which was new. There were places like these galleries where all types of pop stars and theater people and men and women about town would mingle with the artists and actually the wealthy elite. The Robert Fraser Gallery, for example, which was 69 Duke Street in London, and I think he was the guy who in fact persuaded the Beatles to use Peter Blake to design the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What you get in the 60s, in the swinging period, was this fusion and greater interest. So pop music really kind of grew out of that sort of just teenage thing, that the way people had conceived it in the 50s. And it matured, but it added all types of fashion and art interests and literary interests, and it was a pretty heady time.
Well, so many of these guys, so many of the bands from that era had actually got together. It was almost a cliche, wasn't it, that you all met at art school?
Yeah, there was a lot of that. That's interesting. I think a lot of kids went to art school because they just didn't like the normal types of school, so they weren't going to go to universities or something, but they were a real breeding ground.
You weren't just confined to one thing. You could be an artist one minute, a photographer the next, as John Hopkins was a promoter, then a photographer. You could be a record producer, then you could make your own record, or you could write a book as John Lennon. I mean, John Lennon perhaps the best example of somebody who would not be confined. A guy who would paint, a guy who would write poetry, write prose, act. Yeah. Not very well.
But nevertheless, he gave it a shot. But you're exactly right. People weren't confined into, oh, you're a guitar player or you're a painter. There was quite a lot of blending, a lot of experimentation, and people just assumed these roles. Brian Epstein's a very good example, who managed the Beatles. He just had worked in a shop, NEMS, and just turned himself into a manager of bands and became a phenomenon.
It's a time when the establishment decides. The establishment, of course, always does this, doesn't it, Tim? Something comes along that's frightening and new, and at first everybody wants to ban it and stop it, and then the establishment thinks, no. I mean, today, who would have thought Sir Michael Jagger? But of course, rock and roll is now part of the establishment. Sir Elton John, Sir Mick Jagger.
Well, that's right. All these people who seemed quite anti-establishment in their early days then get sucked into it and become the establishment. This is just a process that seems inevitable. I mean, even the appearance of something like Ready, Steady, Go.
Well, hi there. This is Keith Fordyce welcoming you to a very special edition of Ready, Steady, Go. For those of you who don't know this show, I might say that each week we invite all sorts of pop singers along here to Studio 9 in Kingsway, London, and the crowd who come in get a chance to meet their stars close to.
On the one hand, we can see this is spreading this youth music to the kids of the country, but at the same time, it can be seen as a way of the establishment taking control of the youth music and presenting it for the children. An analogous thing happened in America. There were lots of shows like Shindig and Hullabaloo that presented youth music on the television, but more insidious, I think, was what happened in film, where youth music that had been kind of on the fringe, a culty thing and just really known by the participants in it, gets incorporated, if you use that word, by Hollywood.
The best example of that is Elvis, where Elvis is this raw rock and roller. He can't be shown from the neck downwards because he's just too much. He's just too much for America. So Hollywood takes him and it turns him into this caricature of himself. And it's the late 60s before I mean, now it's coming out. Elvis hated being in those movies. He hated singing those stupid songs.
When Elvis died, for example, the story that John Lennon was told, and he said, oh, well, Elvis died when he went into the army, because when Elvis started making films, it really took him far away from what he was originally doing. It made him a huge, huge star. I mean, he was already a huge star, but I mean, it really consolidated his enormous wealth. But he got further and further and further away from what it was that really had made him what it was. And I think this is something that musicians should be aware of, that they can get sucked into these corporate interests and they get turned into something different, and the big bucks and the lots of pounds may attract them, but in a way it kind of changes them from what their original motivation was.